Today I have a great guest, a returning champion to the show, Dr. Corey Steffen, who is a theology professor, and we chatted a couple of years ago. And he was great because of his advocacy for free software in the education system, also advocating free software in terms of religious study. And he's just an all around great guy. Dr. Steffen, welcome back.
Yes, thank you, DT, and I'm very happy to be back on the DistroTube channel. Like I said the last time that I was here on your show, I've been a fan of this channel for many years, going all the way back to the obscure Window Manager project days, before you had a designated studio, before you had over 200,000 subscribers on YouTube and tens of thousands on Odyssey. Back when it was you showing window managers and cool tech tips, I was learning from that, and so I appreciate a lot the work that you do, as well as your advocacy for software freedom. And I'm glad to be here again to talk with you.
Yeah, Corey, the last time you were here, it was interesting because obviously the world was very different, 2.5, 3 years ago. Last time we talked, it was a little more than 2 years ago. And we were still dealing with a lot of the after effects of COVID and the shutdown, which was especially hard on the school systems, university systems. Are we past that? Have we returned to normal yet?
That's a really great question. The short answer is no. So remote instruction with proprietary software, remote testing with lockdown web browsers, these sorts of things that are not good for the overall intellectual freedom of students and faculty alike at universities have proven to have real staying power. And it's a regrettable state of affairs. I do what I reasonably can to do better than that for my own students. For example, I still have, as I said when we last met, that statement on software freedom at the end of all of my class syllabi. I still encourage students to educate themselves about software freedom. But these trends that exploded during the COVID-19 pandemic have proven to have real durability. And that seems to be for a variety of reasons, right? In some instances, they're cheaper for university administrators. In other instances, there's a convenience to it for everyone involved. But all those factors together have meant that those things are here to stay. Right? So at the university level, it's very much so like we're still in 2020, now in 2025.
So students are still having to install like the spyware Chrome extensions and
yes,
having to keep cameras and microphones on them, things like that, like when they're, I guess, doing schoolwork at home. Is anything, are there's still schoolwork done at home that requires like a camera on you? Because I know that was a big deal a couple of years ago still.
Yeah. So I'm not a part of that.
Okay.
I mean, other than things like I want to have a one-on-one meeting with a student, but I say, I don't want to see your space. I don't want to see any of your personal belongings. You can have notes open in front of you, all of that. I just want to have a conversation with you. And I'll have kind of graded conversations one-on-one with students. But other than that, I'm not a part of it. But as far as I know, yes, that's definitely still happening. A curiosity with that is that paradoxically, the rise of generative AI has caused a shift away from that in some quarters, because in online and remote instruction, academic dishonesty has just become so easy and so undetectable that people have a fair number of my colleagues, as most broadly understood, just university faculty at large, have pivoted to more old school testing methods that are better for intellectual freedom and also naturally preventative of things like, ChatGPT, write this essay for me.
Right. And that's the problem is, when they were doing schoolwork at home 5 years ago, they still had to actually do some work to write the paper. They actually had to go read a book and at least understand it and then write out the paper themselves. Now they can actually just tell one of these large language models to write the paper for them.
Mm-hmm.
They never had to read anything. They don't even have to read the paper that was just spit out by the AI. Right?
Mm-hmm.
They can just hand it to their professor.
Yes.
And they learned absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
It's one of the dangers, these AI tools, really dangerous for students, because I think they're great if you already know a subject and you ask it a question on something you already know about. It can give you different perspectives on things you already know. It can color things a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ask it a topic that you know absolutely nothing about, it's horrible. Like, it's the worst thing you could possibly do, in my opinion.
Yes. Well, a lot of institutions still have a dusty closet full of blue books, right? A lot of institutions still have office hours requirements for faculty and or teaching assistants, depending on the size of the institution. So these old school methods, they might be less efficient than what we've been doing in higher education for the last, let's say, 20 years or so, with online testing portals and so on. But they require people to learn things. And
Right.
so so even if the studying, for example, might include generative AI, well, the person still ultimately has to learn the material, which is a different and better situation.
Do you think that more testing, especially at the university level and even high school level even,
Mhm.
should be done with oral exams rather than written exams anyway?
I've used oral exams a lot. I think that they have a tremendous amount of benefit. There's no better way to test I have found that there's no better way to test if a student grasps big to middle picture ideas, the things that really matter as takeaways from a class, than to ask face to face.
Yeah.
Among other things, it allows for a dynamic testing environment without having to code a complicated dynamic testing environment or
Yeah.
some such absurd thing, right? If a student doesn't know 2 or 3 questions a row, start asking easier questions. If a
Yeah.
student is really doing excellently, start asking very high order complex questions. And in that way, it's able to work a little bit like how a lot of standardized tests are supposed to work, in that, right, everybody's starting at a kind of C, right, or mid-level, and persons who do very well get presented with harder and harder questions. Persons who don't do well get presented with lower questions. But everybody's able to sort of prove themselves at the level of mastery of the material that he or she has.
Yeah. I always liked them because you could get immediate feedback from a teacher, which, if you're totally off on something, they can tell you right away. Where obviously just taking a paper test, you don't know. And you may never know, because I've actually, especially at the university level, where sometimes the classes can be gigantic. I've taken classes where there were, more than 100 students in a class. I never had a conversation with the professor for the entire, like a one, like ever.
Sure.
And unfortunately, that is normal, especially at very large institutions. Yes. And I don't think, when you're paying the tuition fees that these kids are paying, I think they're not getting their money's worth.
Yeah, no, that's fair. It is extremely labor intensive. I will say that. And university faculty, especially at small liberal arts colleges, seminaries, places that do not have large budgets, tend not to be paid very much money. And so the oral exam then, again, I've used it a lot, and I really believe in it for a lot of reasons that we've just mentioned. It's really best suited for contexts in which a person is not assigned a massive number of students. It needs to be a fairly small number of students. Because if we think about it, even the 10-minute oral exam, right, if there are, let's say, 90 students, that's 900 minutes.
Right.
That's
That's a lot.
That's a lot
Yeah.
for
All
one
right.
person, and it's a lot of highly repetitive, very exhausting work too.
Mhm.
And so it's really best for contexts with smaller numbers of
Yeah.
students.
Yeah. At
Um,
that point, it would probably be better at like the graduate level when classes are
exactly.
smaller, much more. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a give or take there, and there are pros and cons to any method. The great con of that method is just how much work it is and how time consuming it is, and how much it depends on having a small assignment of total number of students to be able to
Mhm.
really succeed in doing it and not burn out, and so on.
All right. Well, Corey, since the last time we chatted, our last chat was really focused on how the education system here in the U.S.
Hmm.
was obviously kind of slow in adopting the free and open source software model. Have we seen any gains in that in the last couple of years?
I do not think so.
Okay.
I think that the short answer is no, and I think that comes back to one thing, right? Those trends that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic have continued. We just talked about that. Um, Another thing is the sheer power of institutional vendor lock-in. So uh, once an institution has a sort of top-down subscription to software as a service, leaving that becomes almost unthinkable in the context even of a fairly small institution. There are thousands of people constantly coming and going. And so the automation, the management of those utilities with a very small IT team in a lot of situations, that just becomes almost unthinkable. So the power of vendor lock-in is high, and it can be hard, if not impossible, to show that there's any advantage to utilities that might have slightly less convenience when it's multiplied across thousands of people relative to the big tech, right? The Microsoft 365
Yeah.
subscription, the Google services subscription, whatever it might be. Those things just have a tremendous amount of hold, effectively absolute hold on institutions of higher learning. Um,
Yeah, once you buy into the Microsoft ecosystem, yeah, you have to. Every machine has to be Windows. Everyone has to use Outlook
mhm.
Mail. The cloud syncing's all done with OneDrive. Like you have to buy into the whole thing,
Yes.
and it's hard for. I've seen this with businesses. It's hard for them to break away because they've already. It's almost like the sunk cost fallacy, where once they spend so much money on some of this stuff, well, we've already invested all this money and time into all of this. We can't switch away to, for example, a free software solution. I
Mhm.
actually had a buddy of mine who ran his own company.
Mhm.
He had a security company, and he had a particular piece of software. It was proprietary software that was no longer developed anymore, but he depended on it for what he did in his work. It only ran on Windows 98. So he had machines that were still running Windows 98
Oh,
just
goodness.
because there was no other option.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
when I see that, and that's not an unusual event.
Mhm.
There are stores I can go around town that their POS systems, their point of sale systems, are still running Windows 2000.
Mhm.
I've seen it in real life. I've seen kiosks, when they reboot, still running things like XP, and it's crazy. But a lot of that is they just simply can't move. They've
Mhm.
locked themselves into the point where there's no solution for them.
Yes. So, of course, some sort of jail or, like in FreeBSD, or some sort of isolated environment, um, can mitigate some of those problems, and I'm
It's
I'm sure that a lot of listeners who are professionals in information technology would know more about that than I do. But it's never going to be a true solution. It's always
right.
going to be a mere workaround.
It is.
And
I've actually seen some of the smarter companies that did exactly that. They ran like Linux servers,
mhm,
but all of like the individual terminals, all the workstations, they were running Windows and virtual machines
mhm.
for the software that they had to run. But everything was all virtualized. So that was one workaround. But again, it's not. It's kind of a hack. It's not really the solution.
Yes. Well, another, and another problem with the whole vendor lock-in thing at institutions of higher learning is that, of course, there's this common image, at least here in the United States, of the university having a sort of unlimited budget. That's true for a small percentage of universities. That's true for the Ivy League institutions and some other select places. That the budget is effectively unlimited. That's not true for a lot of small
Right.
liberal arts colleges, a lot of seminaries, and so on, a lot of the kinds of places in which I spend my time.
Right.
And
Well, like in your neck of the woods, everybody assumes universities. You're talking what, Texas A&M or
yes,
UT,
yes,
or which are gigantic and they have bajillions of dollars. But that's not what most colleges are like.
right, right, yeah. So their DT is observing. I'm based in Texas right now, so that's why those places come to mind. Right. So anyway, the budget is not it's finite, and good heavens, the sheer percentage of total institutional operating budget that can be completely overtaken by software as a service stacks is really mind-boggling. I mean, it doesn't come to me in the form of salary. Before the conversation, you mentioned if I say anything questionable, I should ask to cut it out. No, I'm okay with keeping that in. It
Right.
doesn't come to me in the form of salary. But
You're not a teacher because you get paid the big bucks.
no, no, certainly not. Right. It doesn't end up in research allowances, right? This just this massive pot of the total operating budget that has
Right.
to go to these software as a service stacks. And it's like tribute to the king that has to be paid year after year with no other option, because of the raw power of vendor lock-in. And it's really, in many instances, it ends up being a kind of tragedy in which, we're talking about not thousands of dollars, but hundreds of thousands of dollars that
Mhm.
institutions really can't afford. And it's for often the subscriptions are for utilities that offer the same basic functionality that equivalent utilities offered 20 or 30 years ago. Right? It's not like we're seeing leap and bound advances in the higher educational software as a service space. Okay, there are these incremental improvements like the rise in stable video conferencing, but that's
Yeah.
as much about infrastructural improvements to the world, to internet infrastructure, and about client hardware speed improvements as it is anything else. So we're not. The point there is we're not seeing the kinds of advances that would in any way justify the gross percentage of total operating budget that goes to these enormous big tech companies and the software as a service subscriptions that can be really oppressive
Yeah.
for institutions of higher learning. And it's all non-free. So it's opposing academic freedom, right? It's corporate spyware, and it is crushing the institution's operating health because it's so expensive. But other than that, it's great.
Right. Well, I'll be honest. Not having chatted with you, the last time we did a video
Mhm.
was a little over 2 years ago. I really
Right.
expected the answer to be, "Oh, it's much better. We've gotten better in this department as far as education and free software." I'm kind of shocked a little bit that you claim it's getting worse.
Well, I don't know if it's getting worse as much as it is um,
It,
staying the same while
yeah,
getting less affordable,
yeah.
which is getting worse. Yeah, that's getting
Well,
worse.
the old adage: if you're treading water, you're eventually going to sink anyway. So
Sure.
even if they're just staying where they're at, that's a
Yeah.
descending path eventually. So,
Yeah. Yes, that's fair.
well, other than this might be a little strange because it's not necessarily your work related, but would you say that free and open source software has made gains other than the education system, like just life in general?
Oh, I absolutely yes.
Okay.
Even in my own professional space, since we last chatted just a couple of years ago, I've been blown away by some developments in the free software space. A real, a different kind of YouTube Linux personality said in a fairly recent video, free software has won, right? And what the person really meant here is we can professionals can do all of our work and persons can go about all of their digital lives
Hmm.
inside 100% or very close to 100% free software contexts. And in my work, that's first of all, that's true, and it's been true for a long time. Second, there are all sorts of just great advances. A couple that come to mind for me right away when you ask that question: Joplin, the Joplin
Oh,
note-taking application. I looked at Joplin a few years ago to
mm,
assist my research, and it was right. It was the kind of dark days before Electron was actually
right.
usable, and it also just didn't have very many contributions. So it wasn't this kind of powerful note-taking utility in the same way that the standbys of the proprietary sphere are. Well, today, Joplin is the best full fat note taking application that I have found. Does that mean that I'm using it every day? Well, no, I have other things that I'm using regularly. I just mean as far as a fully featured academic note taking solution that anybody can just jump in and start using, that's entirely free software. It's incredible. And it's been just the last couple of years, right, with thousands of new contributions in GitHub, with people writing great community plugins. And all of that is because it's free software.
Right.
Another one that comes to mind for me that's also note taking related. I'm entering into a major research project right now, so note taking is very much so on my mind
Okay.
because I have to do a lot of documentation and so on. But this command line note taking software that was first released a few years ago, called NB, Nota Bene, right?
Okay.
NB, like note well. It's a great pun. Um, it came out when it first came out. It probably was a record for the longest Bash script ever written at about 11,000 lines of Bash. Uh,
It's not
but
that long. I looked at a program the other day that was a bash script that was more than 30,000 lines.
holy cow! Okay, well, in any event, I consider me fully corrected. But yes, the point is today it's I forget the length the last time I looked, but it's definitely 25,000 lines or longer. And that's
Mhm.
all just from the free software community congregating around this and contributing. And it's gone from something that made me think, huh, that's an intriguing piece of software, but it's definitely for people who are even geekier than I am. And what I mean by that is it's for people who are documenting their code writing and things like that. It's gone from that just a couple of years ago to today. Just this week, I've been looking at it and going, this looks like something that any geek can figure out and use. And this actually might be what I end up using as I dive into this next major historical research project. And there are things like that all over the free software sphere. And I think it just comes back to the idea that yes, software freedom has won,
Yeah.
but a big part of really why it's won, maybe definitely the biggest part of why it's won, is because it encourages um, people to contribute code, ideas, donations of money, um, even just simple feedback or bug reports can go a long way. And when we pool all of the resources together, everybody contributes just one little piece that he or she is good at contributing. Suddenly, after, in a quite short window of time, something can go from a sort of basic initial implementation like Joplin or NB or was a few years ago to today. Now we're having this contribution, and I'm looking at both of these and going, why would I even consider,
Yeah.
some fat corporate spyware note taker when there are these absolutely incredibly featureful free software projects?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Joplin because obviously it's an Electron app, which uh, Electron apps are everywhere now. Jitsi and Zoom and Discord and Spotify. All everything's this cross-platform web applications, right? It's all Electron and Flutter and all these other frameworks that people are developing in. I think that has really helped in that people are less tied to a specific operating system now. So it's not as hard, for example, to try out Linux or FreeBSD or whatever the operating system is. I do know that the BSDs, at least a few years ago, last time I tried, some Electron applications didn't quite work with it. I'm guessing that's better these days. Are you still using FreeBSD?
Well, right now I'm in Debian stable,
Okay.
so it's kind of funny. As I was kind of reviewing notes and what we talked about last time. Last time I said, for hardware support purposes, I was on rolling release distribution, but I was going to pivot to Debian stable. Well, I've been on Debian stable consistently since then, and why everything just works. And in my work, I do not need the latest and greatest. What I need is to get into an extremely complex multilingual document with subchapters and all kinds of things and have it just work. And so Debian stable has been great. I actually have a flash drive, total aside, not in case it might be of interest to anyone. Void Linux is probably going on my system later today, but there are no flawless transitions, and I didn't want to make an OS transition before we had this video meeting. But Void, see, Debian stable, as you once said famously in a video, is it's great because it's so stable, but it's quote, so stable that it hurts. So so I'm looking now, what I'm looking for as I'm about to pivot into a new major project. Now what I'm looking for is something that is still very reliable and doesn't have the kind of breakages, frankly, that I had when I was using something Arch based. Different needs for different people, right? Hold on, DT viewers. I think Arch is great, and I use it for special kinds of things. I just don't use it in my main work environment because
but Arch does break.
Yes.
Like nobody that runs Arch is ever going to claim that. Like 2 weeks ago, I had an issue with some NVIDIA drivers or something that, and not just me, there were many Arch users that when you rebooted the machine, you just get a black screen, and that's it, and you couldn't even drop to the TTY.
Sure. Oh, that's tough.
You had to cheroot back into the machine to fix the. Yeah. So
I mean, I have Endeavor OS, so I've proof DT fans. Right? There's Arch in my world. But the point there is, I'm just looking for one reason why I find Void so attractive is that it's a kind of via media, right? It's not quote so stable that it hurts, like DT famously said, but it's also not an OS that has hundreds of updates, sometimes each day even, and risk of it's in that middle space, similar to Fedora actually in that kind of regard.
I always told people that Void Linux was like BSD in Linux form.
That's another reason. Yeah, that's another reason why I'm so attracted to it. Actually, the way that the init system works, the way the package manager works, it all feels very familiar to me about a lot of the things that I like about OpenBSD in particular, because it was written originally by a former NetBSD developer.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, but it always seemed like a bunch of BSD guys got together and said, "Let's make a Linux distribution."
Yeah, that's basically what Void Linux
what happened,
is.
Right?
Yeah, that's basically. So anyway, you asked about Electron applications in the BSD sphere. So what I'll say there, and I have to be really careful here to make sure I don't exaggerate anything. In FreeBSD, specifically in FreeBSD, there has been a lot of progress in the last couple of years, to the point that now there are some Electron applications in the official ports tree for FreeBSD, and they just work. And people with really good skills at ports and who know a lot about Electron can package other things for themselves. In OpenBSD and in NetBSD, Electron is really a non-starter, and that's it's Electron is tough, right? Because it's supposed to be fully cross-platform,
right.
but it's increasingly become the case in the world in which we live that the phrase cross-platform means Windows, Mac, and Linux. It does not mean every operating system
Uh,
that exists. Yeah.
these days, sometimes cross platforms means Android and iOS, and that's
Right,
that's
right.
all we're talking about, right? So,
Will will it get there? I do not know. I have not been following the mailing lists. I encourage
mm,
listeners to go check out those things and to contribute and help because we want the stuff to work. It's just it's
mm,
big, complicated to compile, challenging, clunky software,
mm.
and it's been a thorn in the side of a lot of people who work really hard on this stuff for a lot of years.
Well, I might check it out myself because I did notice just a couple of days ago they had a release
Mhm.
FreeBSD. They had a some point release, and it's
Mm.
been a while since I've installed it and done anything with FreeBSD. Maybe it'll be something I do.
Well, the easiest BSD to get going with on desktop, in my somewhat informed opinion, because I've gone through installers of all these, I've daily driven FreeBSD and
Mm-hmm.
and so on, is OpenBSD. OpenBSD
OpenBSD.
comes with its own implementation of Xorg right in the installer. The installer takes just a couple of minutes, and then with its Xorg implementation, if you're on a ThinkPad or if you're on a desktop OS, basically those two kinds of
Mm.
systems, everything works as you expect it to work. The webcam works, volume controls work, trackpad, trackpoint work, and it's a very smooth experience. The question is always, do you have the software support that you need professionally?
Yeah, that's always the problem with. That's this problem with many, especially like independent Linux distributions, is that their repositories just don't have the software
Yeah,
that Debian or Arch are going to have. I mean,
right.
that's why everything bases off Debian or Arch, is because that's where all the software is at. Unfortunately,
Well, and
it's
if
very
it's
hard for a small team to
yeah,
build tens of thousands of packages. I mean, it's all automated with servers, but that requires money.
right. And if it's a GNU Linux distribution that uses mainline glibc and
Mm-hmm.
the regular Linux kernel, app images, as well as Flatpaks and Snap, but
Yeah,
this is DistroTube, so we like app images here.
I do like
The
a good app image. Yep.
um, uh, they help mitigate that a lot for the big GUI applications. Um, but of course, it's never perfect. So I know, for example, that in this pivot to void, one thing, if we have another conversation that I'm sure I'll be talking about, is how many times did I or did I not need to type git clone such and such sudo make add, sudo make clean or what
Yeah.
have you. So yeah.
Yeah. What are you compiling from source? Are you doing something like a DWM or like a
Well,
window
well,
manager or?
Well, well, I'm so I've been on DWM for quite some time,
That,
and one thing that I'm looking at with this transition
that's why you
is
had sudo make install on the
yeah,
brain. It's
yeah,
because you're
yeah,
constantly
yeah,
right.
yeah. I've been on a custom DWM build for a long time. I call it Theology WM.
Yeah.
Uh, of course,
Mhm.
and but one thing I'm looking at is actually transitioning to DWL, the Wayland kind of reincarnation of DWM,
Mhm.
and I have resisted Wayland for a long time, but and like I have said a few times, right? I want things to just work. And so I
Right.
resisted Wayland for so long because things did not just work. You needed X Wayland for a lot, and then that dwindled, but it was still some things. Now, curiously, right, Firefox defaults to Wayland if you're in a Wayland session. Thunderbird defaults to Wayland if you're in a Wayland session. Um, uh, uh, Zotero, my citation management utility, can be given just a flag at launch time and it runs Wayland. And that is intriguing. At the same time, there are a few advantages to Wayland for my work. Like I run a docked ThinkPad with an external monitor, and Wayland has per display scaling. And in
Right.
DWL, a person can hard code each display scale right into one's window, right, compositor. I keep wanting to say window manager, into
Yeah.
one's compositor. And that's compelling for me because uh, uh, not having per display scaling in Xorg causes some mild inconveniences, but there's still inconveniences. Like when I take my laptop away and I go to work somewhere else, everything is really small. And do I really want to recompile DWM every time I'm disconnecting and working on the go versus at my desk? Or do I just want to have that per display scaling hard coded in DWL? So those are some things that I'm looking at right now as a kind of what's next in my work environment.
And luckily, I don't have any weird monitor issues where Wayland offers me really nothing.
Sure.
So
Sure.
I'm not in a hurry to move because I play with some of this Wayland stuff on occasion, obviously testing distros, testing window managers. There's always some things that are broken. You know, it's going to break some workflow naturally. And for me, I've always said that I think most users are like this. Most users care much more about their desktop environment or window manager than what display server they're on. They don't care if it's Xorg or Wayland under the hood.
Yeah, that's exactly
they want
right.
their window manager.
Yes.
And if their window manager is on X11, that's where many people are going to stay for the foreseeable future, unfortunately.
That's right. No, that's right. And so DWL, right, I've followed it for a while, and I think that it is sufficiently mature now that in my testing with it on real hardware, I have a Void Linux installation also on this kind of backup laptop. I've found, it's basically a drop-in replacement for DWM, but with some of those like per display scaling, no screen tearing, and other advantages that come with using Wayland. So that's kind of what's next, I guess, for me is experimenting with some of that as part of rethinking my workflow a bit, though not very dramatically, actually. It's still DW something as I pivot into my next big research project.
Yeah, well, my transition to Wayland will be a little easier because I use Qtile as my window manager. And it's got both X11 and Wayland support, although the Wayland support's kind of iffy, kind of experimental. Although some people claim they're running, I've never been able to get it to work right for me. But I'm not in a hurry.
Right.
When it's ready, I'll already be on Qtile anyway. I'll just log into the Wayland session rather than the X11 session. So
you'll be in Arch, and one day you'll wake up and Qtile will update, and it will just be running Wayland for you, basically.
Well, yeah, you do run into that. Will they ever drop the X11 session? Because I mean, that's what GNOME is planning on doing, right?
I exaggerate, of course, but
but you make a point. That's certainly something that will happen one day in the future.
Yes.
Not anytime in the next few years, probably, but way down the road. Obviously, there's no point in supporting a display server if nobody's using it. Although the BSDs will still be on X11 probably 20 years from now.
That's right. That's something that is a problem, and I have in discussions with leading BSD project leaders in BSD, leading developers, and so on. People are aware of the problem, right? It's Wayland, among other things, the simplest kind of shorthand of the problem is it's made with a lot of Linuxisms, as people say in the BSD world, and so it's not very portable outside of GNU Linux.
Yeah, because X11 obviously predates all of the. I mean, X11 started development in 83 or 84. People don't realize how old that piece of software is.
It's a lot older than I am. Sorry, DT.
Yeah, I was about to say, unfortunately, I've got a few years on it, but very old software obviously needs to be replaced at some point. But right now, X11's working for. I mean, X11's working for everybody that's still on it.
Right.
So it's not like you have to be in a hurry to move. I know some people want to pressure everybody in the community, like we all have to change to this one thing, and no, because I'm not running GNOME ever. If that's because that's like when they say run Wayland, they're really go install GNOME. No, I don't like that desktop environment.
Yes,
and then
you have made many critical comments about GNOME over the years, and
Mm. It's not my least favorite desktop
I'm
environment, but
I,
it's not. I wouldn't run it. Yeah.
yes, I agree with a lot of those.
Mhm.
It is um, I think it's curious that it is the default kind of across the board in the GNU Linux sphere because because KDE and XFCE and LXQt
Yeah.
and Cinnamon exist.
Well, it's
And
so I've been using Linux long
all of those
enough.
things that I just listed are
Yeah,
in many ways more
better.
usable. Yes.
Yeah. Well, if you go back 20 years ago,
And I mean this with great respect
it
to the
wasn't like
people who
this.
work on it.
Yeah. Like 20 years ago, you had much more, you had many more distros that defaulted to KDE,
Mhm,
maybe than even GNOME.
mhm,
And the deciding factor really was like when Ubuntu was created in 2004, the fact that the flagship edition of Ubuntu, which just dominated desktop Linux forever, defaults to GNOME. And there was some debate amongst Canonical. Hey, should we use GNOME? Should we
mhm.
use KDE? And that was kind of the deciding factor. And that's still to this day why so many of the big, especially kind of corporate distros, still lean toward GNOME. Also, the licensing had some issues like between GTK and Qt,
Mm,
those toolkits. Back in the day, Qt was proprietary software at one point before they freed it.
mm.
So that was also one of the issues that played into that. There were a lot of reasons why we've gotten to the point where the desktop Linux is in the shape it's in. Also with the BSDs, how are they going to handle GNOME and KDE both? Are going to be dropping X11 support soon.
Yeah,
What,
so, the best implementation of that right now, is, FreeBSD KDE Wayland. So there's been an official FreeBSD KDE project for a long time, and the idea has always been that a person should just be able to use FreeBSD with KDE as a kind of seamless desktop environment solution. And just the other day, somebody mentioned something to the effect of, "Well, I've been using KDE with Wayland on FreeBSD for a while," and this was in IRC, and and it's just fine. So your mileage may vary, of course. I have not tested this myself, but from my kind of limited perspective, if somebody wants to say, I want to get into a full desktop environment running Wayland in one of the BSD operating systems, the place that I would recommend that the person start is FreeBSD KDE Wayland.
okay, yeah, that's interesting. Well, Corey, I want to pivot here because
Yep.
we've been getting into some serious discussion. I want to have a little fun because I asked you
Sure.
about education
Mhm,
adopting the free and open source model,
mhm.
but also because you're a theology professor, I
Yes.
would love to ask you about religion. What if religions adopted the free and open source model? Because I think in some ways they almost are free and open source because when you think of like religious scriptures, things like the
Mhm.
Bible and the Quran and the Torah, it's all public domain, right? It's all, you can say it's all licensed under, public domain license, a free license. You could also say there has been some open source forking of religion along the way. Like you can get into some interesting parallels between free and open source software and religion.
Yep, so that's a great question. So, the first thing that comes to mind for me when you ask about this,
Mm-hmm.
DT, is um, many years ago now, when the great folks at the Vatican Archives, perhaps the most important collection of religious texts and artifacts in the entire world. And I say that as a Catholic historical theologian, of course, but I think that colleagues of other religious traditions would be likely to agree with me just because of the
Mm-hmm.
sheer volume and kinds of materials that are held in the Vatican
Yeah,
archives.
it's a very large collection
Yes,
of historical important
exactly.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's important for humanity's history,
Right.
right? So it's not just important for me as a Catholic historical theologian, it's also just important for the documentation of human history. Um, when they set out to digitalize the entirety of the Vatican archives, what do they choose as the format for it? Did they choose some proprietary image file type? Did they choose some Adobe whatever, right? No, they chose an open format that is extremely high fidelity that was developed by NASA for space imaging. And among other considerations, of course, the idea is, well, you need to be able to use this format no matter what happens in the digital sphere 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 200 years from now. Because that project of digitalization is not only not free, it's extremely expensive. And it's not only not easy, it's extremely labor intensive. And so, really, it needs to be done one time and it needs to be done correctly the one time. It's been happening for, I want to say 15 years now. Don't quote me on that, as we say. But the point, I mean, it will keep going for a long time still because it's
Mhm.
tens of thousands of documents and it's very, and each has to be handled with care and so on and so on. But in order to have that be a serious contribution to the preservation of human history, the choice was for a fully open file type and a fully open format. That says a lot to me
No.
as far as the kind of victory of software freedom and the
It's interesting.
longevity of it too.
It's interesting you brought this up, the whole digitalization of these archives, because another thing, I see parallels when we talk about software, just technology in general. One of the main concerns of anybody creating any piece of technology is accessibility.
Mhm.
Is how many people can actually use this, regardless of disability or whatever it happens to be. And I think what you just described is great in terms of accessibility. Right now, technology, the sort of technology, has made all these religious texts or teachings, even as video conferencing software. People can now attend church online or
Mhm.
prayer groups online or whatever. I think a lot of that has really greatly increased accessibility in terms of
Mm,
religion.
mm. Yes, that's a an interesting question, and it's one that specifically within Catholicism uh, is difficult because for us everything has to be real and
Mm,
live. So the sacramental is real and the
right.
sacramental is live. And so, right, we don't use fake plants even, right? Because it's real and it's live. And so what we have to look at then is, okay, so beyond the formal, beyond the sacramental, how can we use the digital sphere for the communal
Right. I
more
mean,
broadly
obviously,
understood?
yeah,
So that's where things like, right, well, maybe you can have a spiritual counselor meeting in the virtual
sure.
sphere, and that can be really powerful.
Like,
Or
I
maybe,
wouldn't want to have for example, a wedding ceremony. Probably shouldn't
yeah,
be done on a
yeah,
Jitsi call, right? You probably
yeah, and
shouldn't do that.
that's that. Okay, so that wedding and funeral question, DT, is a really important one because, of course, that's something that to which everybody can relate, right?
Mhm.
I find it highly improbable that anybody would seriously suggest that a remote wedding or a remote funeral would be
Right.
workable. I mean, it would not even be human. And so in the
It would be
Catholics,
the worst possible way to bless that marriage or send that person off on the funeral. I can't even go to the gravesite, right? You
right,
say, hey,
right.
person.
And so that is a kind of lowest common
Right.
denominator, as it were, for
Mhm.
public discourse about this very sort of question. Well, okay, if we can't have the wedding or funeral be remote, then
Mhm.
surely for a serious religious gathering of any kind, it
Yeah.
is incorrect for that to be done remotely.
But
Okay, so
things like a prayer group or a
those, yeah,
theological course,
yes,
things like
yes.
that, I think would.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a line, and the line in Catholicism, it's a clear line. The sacramental always has to be so mass or
Right.
baptism or reconciliation, what have you. That always has to be face to face, live, and real in every way. But there are all these other creative spaces for making use of this new technology that, frankly, and here I can say shame on us, right? In Catholicism, we tend to be really bad about it, right? Because we move very slowly, right?
Are you
And
talking about technology in general
yeah,
or just
yeah,
everything?
technology in general, because
Right.
we move very slowly. And so in that regard, right, having an Odyssey channel even in which I have my course video lectures makes me a kind of eccentric figure, right? Which would not be the case in a lot of other places within world religions, a lot of other places within academia and so on. Um, but there's so much opportunity there then. And there are some places that do the remote and that use the technology well, um, but they're kind of minorities, and I think that overall we are at at a moment in time right now at which the use of digital technologies in the world of religious practice is sort of just beginning,
Yeah, I
um,
think so too.
and and something that I find genuinely exciting and perhaps horrifying both at the same time will be to see how over the whole duration of my career and also my adult life how it changes.
Yeah.
Right? If we were to have this discussion 20 years from now, what would my first thoughts about it be? And the answer is I don't know,
I don't know
because
either.
we're just at the beginning,
Yeah.
the very beginning.
Yeah. So I have an elderly grandmother.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm nearly 50 years old. My grandmother is in her 90s,
Hmm.
still around. Physically, she hasn't been able to, you know, reliably attend church. She's a very religious woman,
Hmm.
probably in 15 years.
Mm.
So she watches a lot of religious programming on TV and things
Sure.
like that. And I wonder about those people, like the infirmed, that
Oh, yeah.
can't actually, get to the actual building, right?
Well,
But,
that's a great question. So again, Catholicism, everything is real, everything is live. We have all these sorts of accommodations for persons who need them for their accessibility, right?
mhm,
A person who cannot physically leave one space to go to mass, for example,
right.
is no longer under that obligation to leave that physical space, right? If you're completely bedridden, you need to stay in bed, right?
Right.
And then you
Of
need to
course.
have a minister come to you, right?
Mhm.
Which is how we're supposed to do it, because the idea is, of course, just providing for each other.
Yeah. I mean, I can see pros and cons to everything because I see technology in a lot of ways solving a lot of problems. I also see it creating a lot of problems,
Mm,
specifically in terms of when we're talking about religion. It can lead to, if everything's online, then everything's kind of superficial as far as your
yeah,
engagement. Are you really committed to the
there's
religion if
there's a
you're,
superficiality
yeah,
to it. There also something that I see all the time is there together with the superficiality, there's a dangerous pairing with just factual inaccuracy, because anybody can say anything on the internet, right? So
sure.
this is an old discussion about online discourse in general.
It's fake news.
Right,
Right.
right. But it's particularly
Mhm.
there's a particular way in which it's dark and problematic in the religious sphere. Anybody can say anything.
Mhm.
That means that people can just constantly spew things
Sure.
that, in some cases, people of all of the world's great religions denounce
Sure.
and attract followings saying those things,
Hmm. Yeah.
which is
There's many examples of that. We're not going to get into for
sure.
obvious reasons because
Yes.
no need to offend people.
Right, right.
But there's definitely ethical implications to technology in religion.
Yeah. And censorship. I
Yeah.
mean, you asked about
Hmm.
we talked about academia, and we talked about software freedom, is that better or worse today, and so on. Censorship is on the rise in a lot of uh,
Hmm.
sort of traditionally free republics and democracies, and it's on the rise in a variety of ways. And I'm going to be very careful about how I say this, of course, because again, I don't need to offend anyone. In the case of the United States, where we both are, it's on the rise from both the political left and the political right kind of simultaneously for totally different reasons. But
I mean,
right.
it doesn't matter what the reasons are, right?
Right.
Anybody, and I've complained about this, and people hate it when I say
Yeah.
this, but political parties, I don't care which one you belong to, the two major, they both want to restrict some of your freedoms.
Yes.
And people don't realize that, and they sign up for a team, and whatever team you sign up for, they want to restrict some people's freedoms, including your own. And many people don't. They've been deluded not to see that. And as somebody that really believes in things like free software, that extends to free speech, free press, freedom of religion, all the freedoms, all what we would consider like almost inalienable human rights, as the founding fathers would put it. And unfortunately, it has become fashionable for people to want to restrict some of those rights. And I think this is something that we're going to face going forward in history, because as the public tends to give up some of its rights slowly and slowly, you never get them back. No one has ever given up a right and ever gotten it back later. That just doesn't happen. And I think more and more people need to realize this, that you can't compromise.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts that come to mind for me with that. First, I think I mentioned explicitly the last time that we spoke, I only host my video lectures in the library platform, in
Okay.
honesty. That's decentralized, and it's always available in Tor. That means that persons who are facing either governmental or other censorship can learn from my materials. And in the religious space, coming back to the religious question in software freedom, that really matters, because it is increasingly becoming the case that big tech censors out religious discourse and education about religious matters.
And depending on the religion, certain countries censor certain forms of religious discourse. Yeah,
exactly. So somebody in the People's Republic of China can log into
I wasn't
Tor.
going to name the country.
No, right,
but go ahead, Gore.
Yeah,
right.
Fine. Right. So the idea there is somebody in that context can come into Tor, into the library system, and can learn from my videos, right? And I take tremendous pride in that. Something else that comes to mind for me, right here close to home, as we think about the rise in political censorship, also corporate censorship, both. And I think the two are closely interrelated. And I think we've seen that they're closely interrelated more and more in the last couple of years, even just since we met. Sometimes it's about, okay, here comes the section of the video in which poor DT gets demonetized.
It'll be all right.
So sometimes it's
watch
about
the video on Odyssey, guys, if it's not on YouTube.
Right, but sometimes, right, on the left, it's often about questions of race, for example, right? And obviously, I believe that any form of racism is not only wrong, but is literally demonic. And on the right, it's oftentimes about questions of nationalism or lack thereof, or it's about questions of sexuality.
They both want to divide people. They just do it in different ways.
Right.
But it's the same basic idea.
Well,
trying to pit one group against the other.
Yes. Yeah. But with the sexuality dimension, obviously, I believe that it's not only wrong, but demonic to have, for example, widely accessible word that cannot be said on YouTube here. Right. But the point is that if we deny space to those things that are so dark, then inevitably we also deny space to the things that are light. Yeah. If we deny space to the bad, we also deny space to the good. And
it's hard to lock anything away as far as information, because I've stated this before. I forget where I got it. It may have been something Stallman said back in the day, but information wants to be free. Like no matter what you do with it, it's going to be out there at some point. So, locking it away behind a paywall or trying, I guess, government conspiracy theories and things like that, everything's going to see the light of day at some point, because information naturally wants to be free.
So, yeah. And so it's tough because, of course, for example, under no circumstances do I want my children to be exposed to things that are about race, which is not even, you know, a part of being human. Race is a modern construct, right? And of
Right.
course, and I don't want them to be exposed to racism, of course not. And I don't want them to be exposed to hypersexualized things, of course not. Yet the slippery slope of censorship is really dangerous. And it's always a small step from saying, an extremely small step from saying, well, that form of communication or that form of expression is now illegal, to saying, well, your discourse, for example, in my line of work, I have to talk about salvation, damnation, sexuality, really difficult problems that touch upon the core of being human and living this life that we live, the relationship between God and humanity, all of these sorts of things, and saying, well, you can't have that discourse.
Mm.
And so it's tough then, right? Because I don't want to protect the people who are doing harmful things in the World Wide Web that are objectively harmful. And yet at the same time, if we're going to have a free society, boy, we have to be very thoughtful about
Yeah.
anything that resembles censorship, because
Well,
those slippery slopes are so strong and so dangerous.
that's another thing. The world these days, people are offended way too easy. You know, one of the things, one of my things to say is that unless somebody puts their hands on you, you shouldn't take offense. You should never
Mm,
be angry,
mm,
because whatever they say, it's just words, right? It's
mm.
just meaningless words. Unless somebody actually physically touches you, it shouldn't matter. But so many people today are so easily triggered by a tweet or a Facebook post, and I don't understand it, because when I grew up, you know, the common thing was, hey, sticks and stones may break my bone, you know, words will never hurt me. Heard that all the time growing up, and people took that to heart. That is not the way people act these days, not with social media.
Yeah. I have not been on a regular form of social media for a long time. I've been in IRC.
That's good.
Uh,
Smart choice.
um, there are different reasons for that. One of them is just simply that academia is often so grounded in ideology
Hmm.
that joining this sort of pseudo public discourse in which all anyone's really doing is hyper curating the way they look. So
Yes,
nobody's actually being authentically
it's all fake.
themselves. It's all fake. It not only does not help with an academic career, but at best it can be neutral, and at worst it can be
Mhm.
harmful, with the person never having done anything even slightly
Oh
wrong.
yeah,
Yeah.
because you could say something that's perfectly okay,
Totally
benign,
innocuous. Yes.
socially normal today.
Yes.
50 years from now, that post is still online, but
Yes.
it has a totally different context now.
Yes.
Somebody could weaponize it against you.
Yes. Yes.
That's the dangers.
In Absolute FreeBSD, Michael Lucas writes in the
Mhm.
early pages when he's talking about joining mailing lists in
Yeah.
Discord. He writes, "quote The internet is forever."
Right.
And that's an idea that I very much so take to heart, right? Well, okay, we have to be somewhat fake in how we curate ourselves online, but we also don't have to be, commenting on rage bait things in YouTube or Facebook or whatever the social media platform of the day is. We can, there's no compelling reason to do that. Again, the most social media that I'm in right now and have been for several years is um, a few select channels in IRC where I'm talking tech and a few other things. Because yeah, I just like Michael Lucas writes, the internet is forever.
Yeah. Yeah, I find social media, it's almost like the opposite of, you know, a church or a temple or, you know, religious structure, where, you know, you go there searching for peace. Social media is where angry people go to get more angry, like
I
it's to
think
feed on that anger.
I think there's something to that, and I think obviously there are contexts in which a kind of public outcry is justified. I think that we don't need a public outcry about everything. You know, what did people do before there was social media? Oh, they talked about in the newspaper among themselves and then they moved on, or
Right.
whatever it was.
Right.
And there's a lot of health to that, right?
Mhm.
I mean, worry about our families, worry about our personal lives,
Yeah, worry
worry
about the
about our
community
friends,
around you,
worry
not
about our
yeah,
communities. Right,
right.
right. You know,
And by community, I mean real people, not pixels on a
yes,
screen. Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of power to that.
Mhm.
And I'm in a line of work in which people do what's called posturing a lot, right? And that's something else that I don't. It's really tempting in social media, and I don't even want to be tempted by it, right? I
Right.
don't want to be tempted by being in a virtual discussion zone that is public and trying to sort of prove that I'm smarter than someone or
Right.
whatever it might be. I just don't want any part of it. It's not good for it's not good for anyone's well-being. There
Mhm.
are way better ways of engaging with people, and often they are um, often they're communal or they're in private or whatever. Because if you think
Yeah.
about
Not
Twitter, if
every conversation needs to be public, right?
right, right. And if we think about right, I mean, if we think about what is it called now? X, right? If we think, or
Yeah.
formerly the platform formerly known as Twitter, not uh, uh, I always use the analogy with my students. Posting something on Twitter is like standing on a soapbox out in public and yelling things. And so I say, okay, is the way that two people come to an agreement about something ever two people standing on opposing soapboxes and yelling? Or is it, let's sit down in a quiet corner of a coffee shop and talk for an hour, right?
Yeah.
It's that second thing. And I think that there's a lot to be said um, for the idea that even in the digital sphere, we can approach things more like that. We can
Yeah.
have small channels in IRC, or we can have video conferences with one-on-one, whatever it is. There are just better ways of communicating ideas.
I agree. I agree. Well, Corey, one last thing I want to touch on because the last time you were here, we did talk a little bit about free and open source gaming, specifically your love
Oh,
of the
yes.
game Zero AD,
Oh, here we go.
which I
Yes.
hadn't actually played Zero AD in probably a couple of months.
Mhm.
But when you emailed me the other day about this chat, you reminded me about Zero AD. I actually fired up the game last night and I played a 1v7 game against the AI.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it didn't go well. So, but
I was just going to say, you must be very good at Zero AD if you can
well,
do
I
that.
used to be able to handle that, but
Okay.
again, I
Okay.
hadn't played the game. Give
Okay.
me a couple of weeks, I'll be back in shape, right? So, but I wanted to bring up because you'd mentioned that you had written a paper.
Yeah.
You had a peer-reviewed paper on open source gaming, specifically on Zero AD,
Oh, thank you for asking about this. Of
and I
course.
will link to the paper in the
Oh, yes,
description.
of course. Thank you for asking about this. And of course, I'd like to talk about it because it touches upon a few things that we've talked about today. So
Mhm.
first, it's a Creative Commons licensed tutorial in the peer-reviewed academic journal called Programming Historian. And the title is Teaching History and Languages with a Strategy Computer Game, Zero AD
Mm.
in the Classroom. And so what it comes back to was when I was teaching classical Greek a couple of years ago, I had these really excellent students who were so studious that we completed the whole textbook that I was told that we should use before the semester ended. And I said, well, what we're going to do, because we've finished early, as it were, is we're going to practice Greek in
Mm.
a free and open source computer game, Zero AD, because of course the names of the units are
Right.
in restored classical Greek. The units say things in restored classical Greek pronunciation. It's really compelling.
Yeah,
And
there are. How many civilizations are there in 0 AD now? It's like 14, 15.
about that many.
But there's three Greek civilizations, right?
Yeah,
You got the
yeah,
Athenians, the Macedonians, and Sparta.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. So yeah, and you know what? We had a lot of fun with this. So I told the students I'm going to write a tutorial for this for an open access academic journal. So I have what I think is probably, well, it might be the first ever academic article about an open source computer game. It's definitely the first one about 0 AD
Right.
specifically. It's cool. Let me think. So I encourage someone who might be in education, right, watching your video to work through this. If you're teaching ancient languages or ancient history, um, or medieval studies, um, or or even honestly things related to team building, right? You can benefit something from it. But what I want to talk about for DT and for the DistroTube channel is some cool kind of new frontiers in academia that this reflects. So first, it's fully open access. The journal is, all of the articles are. You sign an agreement that you accept everything being published under CC BY 4.0 and so
Okay.
on. Um,
One
it's
thing I wanted to ask about the you mentioned it's a different model, open source, peer
Yes,
review. So everything's out in public. There's no
yeah. So
anonymous peer review because that's
no,
how it's
no.
typically. Okay.
So the peer review process is done in GitHub with this journal, the
Oh,
Programming Historian.
okay.
And when I first got into it, I thought, well, this is cool, but I don't know how this is going to go because it's different. It's completely different than, let's say, the standard peer review that I have in my lines of work.
Where you
In
don't really know who's the referee, reviewing
yeah,
the work, or
yeah,
it's
yeah,
all done under the table, right? You don't.
yeah.
Yeah.
So completely different. And there's not live, and there's not, well, there's not this kind of this close back and forth discussion happening and so on and so on. I found that while it's by no means perfect,
Mhm.
among other things, it was a very long process.
Yeah.
Um, 2 whole years of peer review and editing and back and forth and so on. Um, I found that it makes me think that this is going to be a big and important part of our future because it, it we're increasingly in a remote work world. We're increasingly in an asynchronous working world. I think that using tools like GitHub or GitLab for kind of open and transparent review processes for a range of different kinds of academic publications, and having the materials be released with Creative Commons and open licensing, I think that it's going to be more important as time continues rather than less important.
A new question just popped in my mind because it's specialization,
Mhm.
especially among educators. Everybody wants to be specialized in a specific area, sometimes a really niche thing they focus on. That is the norm now. Uh,
Mhm.
Generalization, definitely not the norm. Is that a good thing? Because this is something, do you want somebody that knows a whole lot about one specific topic or knows a little bit about a whole bunch of stuff?
Yeah,
Uh,
it depends
is there room
contextually.
for both, maybe?
I think there's room for, yeah, that's a great question. It varies by context. I think that it increasingly has become the case that some
Mm.
of both are needed. Um,
Just for context, sometimes you need to know a little bit about maybe an area that's not necessarily what you focused on.
yeah, well, I think, yeah, I mean, what's increasingly becoming the case is that university faculty are being called upon to teach very kind of general courses, but the publication pathway is very niche.
Right.
So there's a sort of ever growing disconnection between a person's research and publication agenda and a person's teaching responsibilities. And it's this is one of many areas in which I just can't know what the future is going to hold. I have to work in the system because I'm
Right.
trying to have a career here, but the system is difficult. I mean, it's having that disconnection, for example, right? Here's how it can come out. And I want to be careful here, and then I want to go back to something else just a second.
Okay.
But here's how it can come out. For example, right in a typical job interview, you have to an academic will have to show, right? I know sort of these huge sweeping things that are required for teaching this enormous array of general classes that I'm expected to teach in this job, and simultaneously I have to show this really genuine sort of sub or even sub specialization in an area of research and publication. And both of the things can be true. And when I talk about them, for example, if I'm in an interview context, I mean them, and I mean them to be true. But that's a tall it's a tall charge, and the creativity that's available within that space is not always as high as anybody in academia wants it to be when we get into academia in the first place. Oftentimes we end up sort of locked into different pathways when what we really want is to have more flexibility.
Right.
So
One thing I want to revisit, pivot back to a little bit too, is when you mentioned that the open peer review was done on GitHub.
mm-hmm.
I was not aware of that. I really didn't. I had no idea there was even such a thing as an open peer review, right? Because this must be a rather new phenomenon. The first I heard about it, but now that you tell me it's on GitHub, so not only is it done out in the public, but it's done very publicly. There's got to be some issues with that, because I see so much drama, for example, in open source development, software development, because there's communities, right? And there's personalities. Some personalities clash. There will eventually be, again, because nothing is anonymous, people that don't like you for whatever reason, or do like you for whatever reason. It's going to affect that review. Because they already know who you are anyway. Does that worry you at all? That I guess I never want to say something is too open, but it almost can be, I think, in that aspect.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're onto something there. That was actually something I wondered about in this specific process.
Because we talked about the evils of social media, and it's almost an extension of it. Things like GitHub and GitLab, as far as
yes. Yeah, there can be. So in this context, everybody was well intentioned, right?
Sure.
And so that made it.
There's plenty of good communities,
Yeah.
right? We shouldn't let the bad actors paint everybody with that brush.
Right. So working with the folks at the Programming Historian, I'll have to let them know that we talked about this. But working with them was quite easy, especially once we got to that GitHub space where, okay, we intend to publish this. Now let's go through our review and editing process. But it's not perfect. I mean,
Right.
anonymous. So something, you asked about anonymous peer review. On the other hand, anonymous peer review is not perfect.
No, it's not. It has pros and cons too. There's there's never a right or wrong answer to some of this.
It's often the biases can be quite strong that people often the negative biases can be quite strong that people face in allegedly anonymous peer review. And it can, because when people are specialized, back to this question of specialization, it is unusual for something to be fully anonymous. because
Because
they're
it's such a small
exactly,
space, right?
exactly, yeah. So that's the simplest way of putting it.
Yeah,
Now I've been blessed in the anonymous peer review processes that I've been a part of, again, to have sort of good actors with good intentions, and so on. But that's definitely not everyone's experience.
right.
Another challenge with the anonymous peer review is, people can say anything. So
There's no repercussions. You don't know
no,
who I am, so
yeah,
right.
exactly. Yeah, the
Yeah.
only person who knows who you are is the managing editor, who's a referee. So yeah, uh, yeah.
Yeah. All right, Corey. Well, I think that wraps up any questions I had for you today. We've been going at this for a little while. Any final thoughts? Obviously, I'm going to link to your website. You still do Odyssey? You still have an Odyssey channel?
Yeah, it's not very active
Okay.
right now, but I still have it, and I still occasionally am adding new materials for my classes. I just came to a point where in which I have it kind of built up. It's the point that I don't need to be uploading very regularly.
Sure.
But I still do use it in my teaching, and I still have all the materials there, and I still add new things sometimes.
Yeah. You use it for like a resume. You know, it's like, hey, I've got these videos on these topics, or
Yeah, I can do that, and also in my classes, a
mm,
lot of my video lectures that I have hosted on Odyssey, I have as a kind of part. I call it readings and lectures. So students typically find it very helpful to learn in kind of organized video lecture format, among other considerations. Just so many people today, especially university age students, are just used to learning by talking heads, right?
right.
So they're used to learning with something like what you and I are doing right now, and so that have being the talking head can help kind of bridge the gap between how they've been learning until getting to university, and then how they're supposed to learn in university. Like, oh goodness, I have this massive complicated text in front of me that I need to
Yeah.
read, and how do I do this? Oh, a video lecture is going to walk me through it, that
Yeah.
sort of thing.
Yeah, I was always one of those people, still am. Uh, I have no problem reading to
Hmm.
learn something. It can be a really complicated thing. If it's in a book and you give me enough time, I'll work it out. Many people, though, especially nowadays, they grew up visually learning. It's all in video now. So I think it's great that things like Odyssey exist, all these video content platforms, because in many cases, I think some of our young people wouldn't know half of what they know without these platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, because when I was young, we went to a library, and there's very few libraries that exist anymore. Like physical libraries, you go in, check out books. I've got one by my house. I sometimes visit, but again, it's just the way technology has changed the world.
Yes. Um, it's increasingly becoming the case that spaces in university libraries are having, like,
Mm,
stacks of books are being moved into storage units so that more spaces can be made for like collaborative study zones and things like that.
yeah,
And those are always contentious movements. I'm not
right.
going to comment. In fact, to the point that I will not comment on them here. I'll just say that they're happening right before our eyes, right?
All right. Well, Corey, thank you for hanging out with me today. This was a fun chat. I know we've been chatting for a while. When we did this last time, there were a lot of people that had a
Mm.
lot of positive feedback, and they wanted to reach out to you. Where is a good place for people to contact you or just keep up with whatever it is you're doing in the online space?
Yeah, so on my website, CoreySteffen.com, I have I keep a pretty good curated set of materials about what I'm working on and things like that there. And there's a contact page that people can visit if they want to write to me. And I'm always open for fielding emails from the curious and things like that.
Very cool. Well, thank you, Corey. Let's do it again sometime, and maybe sometime in the future I'll catch up with you and we'll play a game of Zero AD once I'm back in shape.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, Corey. Peace.
Peace.